Welcome back to another Reaper log tutorial. This is what's new in 7.37. There's a bunch of changes to rendering, to the action list, and to the big clock. Let's go. Actions. Add insert new track as first track. Also add support when using insert tracks dialog. So let's say we've got a bunch of tracks in the project, and by default, the new track goes below the one you had selected. If we right-click on a track, we can go to Insert New Track, or the new option, Insert New Track as First Track. That adds in a new track 1. You may have noticed that there's also a Add New Track at End of Track list. I think that's been there for a while. I couldn't remember exactly how long that's been there. This is also in the Track menu. So Insert New Track as First Track, Insert New Track at End of Track list, and Insert Multiple Tracks. This has been here for a while. But this now has the option as first tracks in project. So let's add 2 tracks named bass as first tracks in the project, and that's put in 2 tracks named bass at the beginning of the project. Batch converter. Use media item position in project when converting media items and preserving metadata start position. When trimming leading silence and writing metadata preferred position, adjust preferred position after trimming. All right, so we've got an item here, and let's bring it into the batch converter. And I'll click on add, and then I'll do add selected media items. Now in this post-processing section, we have the option of padding the start, padding the end, trimming leading silence. Let's just say 4 milliseconds padding the start. If we're converting this to a different format, let's explode just 2 mono files, and we'll preserve the metadata and the offset. So that will be adjusted based on this 4 millisecond setting here. So if there's any silence under -40 decibels, it will move the start to there, but then it's going to add in 4 milliseconds start pad length. That will be reflected in the metadata, which is pretty cool. Preferences. Move meter decibel scale options to theme-specific settings set via theme tweaker. All right, so we're talking about the meter markings, the scale settings here. So in my setup of this theme, I've got it set so that when the track is record armed, the meter scale is there. Now in the theme adjuster, we go to themes, theme adjuster, and in the mixer controls, we enable all of these, show meter values, and if unselected, show meter values. We can now see selected, unselected, armed, disarmed. The meter scale is always shown there. This can also be set in the theme tweaker. This is kind of the older way of adjusting themes, but this is still useful in certain contexts, more specific color changes, things like that. And also this applies to all themes, not just the default 7. We can also toggle these on and off here. So again, this is something that will apply to all themes. So let me grab a theme that, let's see, my taste 2 is a Reaper 6 theme. And so this will now toggle that as well. MIDI Editor. Follow visible grid preference when inserting grid size notes. Improve maximum horizontal zoom range. Preserve editor configuration with gluing items, recording to new items on a track, etc. So in the previous update, we got this option when you are in View, Piano Roll, Time Base, and you're on Project Beats. When you're in the editor and you zoom out, it was limited to roughly the range of maybe like this much. And in this update, they've kind of increased the max range to, this is now 80 or so bars. It's not going to zoom out infinitely unless you are on View, Project, or Piano Roll, Time Base, Project Synced. Now Project Synced, the arrange view and the MIDI editors are synced in terms of view, so it can kind of zoom out infinitely. Let's go back to the default for Piano Roll, Time Base, and Project Beats. The zoom out range has increased, but it's sort of Maybe it's more of a percentage of how big it is. I'm not really sure how else to explain it, but it's definitely a lot less limited than it was before. So they reduced the infinite range of zoom out down to a smaller amount. Then they tweaked it a little bit based on user feedback, and now it's like this. So in the previous video, I talked about the snap to visible grid option. Now, when this is off and you are inserting notes, they're always going to follow your grid size or your note size, depending on what you have set at the bottom of your MIDI editor. So mine's set to 16th note and note set to grid. So when I double click to insert a note, or if I drag, it's going to be kind of restrained to the amount of, is going to be constrained to the note size. And also, if I use an action to insert a note, it's going to be limited to that specific size. Whether I'm zoomed out this much or zoomed in this much, it's always going to be the same amount, right? Makes sense, but it's not always the most convenient way. And so what they added in 7.36 was snap to visible grid. And that was, so if we're zoomed out and we double click, that's going to make a note. And that is actually not a 16th note. That is an 8th note based on the zoom level. So if I zoom out really far and then insert a note, that's now a whole note. So the visible grid size kind of adjusts the insert note size. In the previous update, that was only affecting when you double click to insert a note. And now the insert key will also do larger notes depending on how far out you are. So when you're zoomed in quite close, you can get 16th notes, 32nd notes. Zoom out a bit further, then you get 8th notes. A bit further, you might get a quarter note. And then eventually you'll get to a whole bar. So that's automatically enabled when snap to visible grid is on. The length of the note is linked to the visibility of those grid lines. And also, if you have a bunch of custom settings for a particular MIDI editor, and then you make another item, you want those same settings from the previous item to apply to this. Or if you glue two items together, you want them to be to keep the same MIDI editor settings. That should be the case now. There's various situations where they would kind of revert to settings of a different item or sort of a default, an unknown default. Now it should, when you make an item and then make another item or you glue it, it should kind of retain all the settings that were originally there. Big Clock Plus. Double-click anywhere in the window to open customization dialog. Double-click on resolved rec tag or rec pass wildcard to set new value. Support project POS, project length wildcards in various time formats, including whole measures or beats within measure. Wildcard track item resolves to item notes for empty items. Add master peak and master loudness wildcards. Add region previous, region next, marker previous, marker next wildcards. And support up to 8 rows of wildcards. All right, so let's go to the view menu and bring up Big Clock Plus. I covered this quite a bit in the previous update video. If you missed that, there will be a link below. But now double click will open up all the options. You don't have to click the little 3 dots there, which is great. And now there are 8 rows instead of 5 that we can fill in with different wildcards. And again, we can toggle those right there. So if we've got a rec tag, and we'll just have to set the rec tag first. So we'll go to recording tag, pass counter, set recording tag, AAA. Now the rec tag is there. Now in 7.37, we can double click that if it's being displayed in Big Clock, and we can just change that to BBB. That's a rec tag. We can also enable rec pass. So we got next pass 1. If we double click here on the 1, we can now change that to the next recording will be numbered number 5, and then we can display that there. The rec pass number always increments based on how many recordings we do. So let's just arm an empty track, hit record, stop, and now the next one is 6. Now the next one's 7. Those are some basic things that we can do within the Big Clock Plus, namely that double click in sort of an empty area of the Big Clock will show all the settings, and we can double click on the rec pass number. We can also double click on the rec tag name to set that there. Then we have some new wildcards like master peak and master loudness, and I just put a pipe signal symbol in between these so that it would show that. Show both of them at the same time. We also have some new wildcards such as wildcard POS or position. That's going to use the ruler format automatically, so minutes and seconds, or hours, minutes, seconds, frames will display there. That can also be done with a custom format, but I don't know the specific sort of formatting that you need to type it in. And you can also do a project length wildcard here as well. So that will be based on if you have a end marker or just the last item in the project. Yeah. Now let's try out the track item wildcard here. Let's just make that the only one there. If I go to insert menu and go to empty item, I can edit a note, special item, and the track item wildcard will show that item note. But otherwise, if it's just like an empty MIDI item, that's going to show the name of that file. There's an empty MIDI item, there's a WAV file, and there's an empty item with a note in it. I have a feeling that they're going to tweak this even more, add even more wildcards. People seem to be really liking this Big Clock Plus. Render. Support rendering selected items or razor edit areas as one file. Add render setting to enable parallel render via master. Improve render speed with various combinations of post-processing settings using multi-threaded processing. After canceling incomplete render, prompt the user to save or delete the partial rendered output files. Add preference to suppress prompt to save delete incomplete rendered files. Add preference to enable actions to open statistics for most recent render after the render window has been closed. That's only about a third of what's new for the render window. So let's look at that. So if I have a bunch of items here and I go to the source section, we now have this option of selected media items as one file, or if I have razor edit selection, I can do razor edit areas as one file. So we'll create one file for all of these selected items, which is pretty sweet. So that would essentially be like a time selection for this area. But this is not going through different tracks. It's not going through the master track. And I think technically these items can be on separate tracks as well. Just to make that a little more clear, items can be on separate tracks. If they're overlapping, they will be merged together, summed together. And any gaps that you have between items will be in that final file. It's very similar to like a time selection type export. Now, if we're rendering things, media items or selected tracks via master, let's say, we now have the option of doing a parallel render. You can see here that this option is disabled. But if we go to any of the ones that are selected tracks via master, region render matrix via master, selected media items via master, razor edit areas via master, let's do selected tracks via master. I'll select 2 tracks. And we have this option of parallel render. It's well worth reading the help file here. Parallel render means rendering multiple tracks at the same time to speed up render times. This happens automatically in most cases, except when the render source dropdown is set via master, in which case parallel rendering must be enabled manually. Parallel render via master requires invisibly duplicating project effects during the rendering process. If the project is resource constrained, or if certain plugins require a long time to load, then parallel render via master may take a long time, or incorrectly render silence for some files. If you enable parallel render via master, be sure to verify that all files are rendered as expected. It's a neat option. Basically, it's like duplicating the master track so that separate files or separate tracks can be processed in parallel. Definitely, if your project is struggling to play back normally, it's probably not going to work for you. All right, so I'm going to render these items, and I'm going to try to cancel it right away. All right, so I just canceled the render, and now I've got this Reaper render incomplete kind of warning. Save incomplete rendered files, yes or no. Up to this update, incomplete files were always saved. And so there is a preference that I'll show you in a sec to basically never show this window. But now we have the option of not saving. It'll just automatically delete those files. Amazing. And so that preference is Preferences, Audio Rendering, and always save incomplete rendered files without prompting, and enable that or disable that. Now the render stats window, once it's closed, generally it's just gone. You don't have that. If you don't generate the HTML file immediately, there's now an option on the same preference page, Stats Charts, Calculate Statistics when rendering, and then keep render statistics in memory after render finishes. So if that is available, and let's just render these and overwrite. And we go to Stats and Charts, open render in web browser. Yeah, we've got this here. Let's close that and close this window and open render statistics from most recent. That's possible. This was possible before, but now they're making it so that it's not stored in memory unless you choose to. If this preference is disabled, then your render stats are lost basically when you close. Let's give it a new name and render. Amazing. Close this window. Do we have this option? No. So it's not saved because we closed that window. There is a prompt, and if we click yes, that's enabled that setting. Reaper is now going to keep that render stats in memory next time we render. Support padding start-end with silence. Support trimming silence from start-end of rendered files. Support adjusting monomedia by plus or minus 3 dB, regardless of whether normalizing is enabled. Apply post-processing fades before start-end padding. Support normalizing, limiting, trimming to master mix. Support normalizing and or limiting each file separately or as if all files play together. All right, so back to the render window. This whole panel is now called post-process. You probably saw that in the batch converter earlier. There are a few new options here. Things that were available in the batch processor before because it's an offline process, but it's now available here in the render window. So we've got normalize as we've had for a couple years. We've got the brick wall limit here. And I should show you that you can now toggle this on and off, and all of those settings will stay active, but disable the post-processing step entirely. And also this can't be checked unless there's something selected. Adjust mono files by an additional -3 or +3. This is a compensation for when you are working on a sound in Reaper and it's playing out of stereo speakers. It's going to sound louder than if it's playing out of a single speaker. Now, sometimes you're working on stuff that as a destination will be a single speaker, if you're 0.1 or Atmos or any sort of installation where there's like 30 speakers and each one is a mono speaker and you're sending individual files to just that speaker. And this is a situation where you might want to adjust that. So when you're working in headphones or in your studio speakers, it's not panned to one side. You're listening through in mono on 2 speakers. There is a difference there. We can now render a file and then trim it back to basically where there's content. So -120 is the threshold for the peak there at the beginning and the end, which is pretty sweet. And then we can add in an additional some small amount of padding. So 1000 would be 1 full second of padding. And we can also pad in the end here. The post-processing help here has a list of the order: trim, leading, trailing, silence, pad, start, end with silence, fade in and out, normalize, mono adjustment, and brick wall limit. all of those apply in that order, not necessarily the order that we see here, but it's an order that makes sense. And then more information about each of the different things. So there is a new normalize option, normalize as if files play together. So as if the files were playing simultaneously is the new option there. You're going to choose a different normalize setting based on the simultaneous volume versus individual volumes. Normalizing each file separately would obviously, if we're set to minus 24 LU, each one gets set to minus 24 LU. But if we're choosing normalize as if files play together, we can normalize things that are too quiet up until the sort of summed level becomes minus 24. Or we can normalize as if they apply together, and the same amount of normalization, same gain change will apply to each file individually. I want to record a little clip to show the differences between some of these render normalize options. So the option normalize as if files play together, the first one of the two, that's what you're seeing here on track 3. So I started with some sine waves of different volumes, so minus 12, minus 6, and minus 2. Once you use that setting to normalize, each of these are turned down by different amounts to hit that minus 24 LU target. So let's say we need 12 decibels of gain reduction or gain change to bring it down to the target value. All three of these would be minus 12 rather than each one of these getting some amount of gain change to hit minus 24. And also, if we had multiple items in the project sort of layered like this, and we selected those to render, that can also influence the as if files play together. So start and end times of the selected items makes a difference as well. And if this is confusing, it's complex, and it's not something that you'll be using every day, most likely. But, they're trying to add features that, help with all users, all industries, that use Reaper for audio. Support preview playback of rendered files. Route render playback to master track hardware outputs. Support changing preview file via list view keyboard navigation. If rendering multiple files at once would overwrite some files, support overwriting all, or rendering only new files and skipping existing files, or canceling. All right, so let's take these files and render out selected media items via master, and so I'm rendering 4 files. And now you'll see this window is a little bit different, but kind of ignoring these this new appearance. But there's now preview controls right here within the render window. So we can click on one to select it, choose the different item, and so spacebar will play. And this is routed out through the main mix channel, the main master channel. So keyboard shortcuts to play. There's a volume control. We can loop the sound. All the sort of normal playback controls are there. And it feels very intuitive. We can click on one. We can use the keyboard shortcuts up and down to select them. So I'm going to hit back to bring back the render file window. I'm going to render again with the exact same settings. And now we've got this render warning. Files already exist. And there's just a few new options here. So silently increment file names, which is the same as this option here. We can overwrite files. We can write new files and skipping existing files. All right, so it took a little bit of messing around, but I'm able to show you this new function. If you're doing a new render and some files have been rendered, some haven't, sometimes it's really tricky to reduce down your selected items to just the ones that are new that need to be rendered. There's now this option to write new files and skipping existing ones. Overwrite files will render new files for each of the selected items, but write new files, skip existing files is pretty neat. So I'll just do that, and it rendered just the one file. And so that's it for this Reaper update. I think this is a pretty good update. Lots of nice features for the Reaper render window. and for the Big Clock Plus. So I'll ask you in the comments, what's your favorite feature added in this Reaper update? And what's your favorite Reaper update from this year? Let's have a chat in the comments. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Facebook and Blue Sky. Support the Reaper blog through Patreon or YouTube membership, and visit reaper.blog for more tutorials.